This will be appearing soon in American Vision's The Biblical Worldview, and you have an advanced copy of it here for the sake of our discussion, an illustration of what I've been trying to teach you. I give a little bit of background on Bertrand Russell at the beginning of the article, pointing out that he was a controversial figure in 20th century philosophy, but a well-respected figure in 20th century philosophy, and yet a man, for all of his dignity as a philosopher and his reputation, a man who changed points of view more times than you would expect of a very intelligent person. This shows, in one sense, Russell's integrity, that when he ran into problems with a particular philosophical outlook, he realized that he couldn't just, entrench himself and try to rationalize and defend it to the hilt. He was a man who was willing to change his mind. That's good. What's bad is the fact that he kept changing his mind showed that he didn't really have a foundation for what he believed. He didn't really know what life was all about. Even though he was respected, is revered by students. In fact, you read some of the stuff that his students wrote about him, and it's almost like he walked on water. He was a very intelligent man, and yet he didn't know what everything was about. He couldn't come up with an epistemology, a theory of knowledge, that avoided certain internal problems, and he himself recognized that, and even his better students will write. Russell himself didn't have an adequate answer for some of these problems. And yet, this same man knew very well that Christianity was wrong. Now, you need to put these two things together about what you know about Russell, because they make an interesting dialectical tension. On the one hand, Russell said, we really can't come up, or we haven't yet come up, with an adequate theory of knowledge. But even though we haven't arrived at that, we know that you aren't right. Nobody knows for sure, Russell said, but we know that you're wrong, you Christians. So you can't have it both ways, can you? You can't say nobody knows for sure, or I haven't got an adequate theory of knowledge, but on the other hand, I do know that you don't know what you're talking about. Just won't work. He's got to have some viable alternative on the basis of which and in terms of which he attacks the Christian faith. I point out next in the article that Russell was hostile toward religion in general and Christianity in particular, saying that religion was really an impediment to human progress. I quote him as saying, I am as firmly convinced that religions do harm as I am that they are untrue. And we see a defiant expression of his own atheism and materialism in his article, A Free Man's Worship. This is what I quote him as saying there. Brief and powerless is man's life. On him and all his race, the slow, sure doom falls pitiless and dark. Blind to good and evil, reckless of destruction, omnipotent matter rolls on its relentless way. And in the face of that nihilism and ethical subjectivity, Russell called men to what he thought was an invigorating free man's worship. He said, to worship at the shrine that his own hands have built, undismayed by the empire of chance. Oh, these are stirring words, but look at what he's saying. Omnipotent matter rolls on its relentless way. This is a chance universe. Only matter exists. And yet, on the other hand, he says we are to assert our own values in the face of that blind, relentless matter. Values? There are no values in a universe that's made up only of matter. So here you have a man who was a brilliant man, a good public speaker, could write stirring prose like that, and yet openly contradicts himself. Has a worldview that cannot even make sense out of his own speech here. Now, why did Russell say he couldn't be a Christian? Well, I give 4 reasons in the article that summarize what he said in his article, Why I Am Not a Christian. He said, because the existence of God cannot be proved by unaided reason. What I go on to say in the article is unaided reason can't prove anything. And that's demonstrated in terms of what I've showed you this morning. Russell had no answer for the uniformity of nature by his own admission. He said, past observation cannot lay a rational foundation for future expectation. And yet he continued to act like we could be scientific. Russell said that there are serious defects in the character and teaching of Jesus, that he wasn't the wisest and best of men, but inferior to Buddha and Socrates. And yet Russell also says that there's no foundation for objective and absolute values. Now, if you don't have an objective value by which you evaluate Jesus and Buddha and Socrates, then how can you say that one's inferior or superior to the other? Russell just shot himself in the foot, didn't he, in trying to argue that way. He says that people accept religion on emotional grounds, which is not worthy of self-respecting human beings. At the end of the article, I point out that Bertrand Russell didn't have good intellectual grounds for what he was saying, and that we need to look elsewhere for why he hated Christianity so much. What I'm suggesting is his was an emotional aversion to Christianity just as much as he said Christians and religious people on the basis of emotion believe what they do. That is to say, he was guilty of the very thing he was accusing others of. And finally, he said the Christian religion has been and still is the principal enemy of moral progress in the world. But of course, the whole notion of moral progress requires for its meaning some absolute standard of value in terms of which things progress or are retrogressive. And we've already indicated Russell didn't have any such absolute standard whatsoever. In fact, on his view, history wouldn't have any meaning whatsoever, much less a progressive view, a meaning that shows progress in history. Now, I've run out of time, and that's why I've had to hurry through this article, but since you have it in your hands, you can go and look at that and examine it more. I hope that you will see in the article an illustration of the principles of defending the faith that I've been laying out for you these last few days here at our conference. At the opening of the article, there is a summary of the approach to apologetics which I am using in this series for American Vision, and which we hope will become a book on apologetics someday. And that summary should work to a certain degree in summarizing for you what I've been saying at this conference as well. In conclusion, let's remember the stirring words of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 at the 20th verse. And make that the motto of what we do when we go out into the world, we go to college, wherever we may be. And we need to defend the faith. And we recognize we're dealing with somebody who's got an antithetical worldview, a whole system of thought and philosophy which is, in principle, contrary to what we believe as Christians. Paul said, where is the wise? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of this world? And when you take that approach to apologetics, you have to end up where Paul ended up, thanking God that in his own wisdom, which the world considers foolish, he was willing to save us by the power of the cross of Jesus Christ. The reason why we have hope in doing apologetics is because we know that God was powerful enough to save us, to change our minds, and to bring us into his kingdom, the kingdom of his dear Son. And for that reason, our labor will not be in vain as we try to defend the faith with others. That the same God who drew you into his kingdom can draw others as well. Your job is not to change their hearts. Your job is simply to be faithful. Do your best to close the mouth of the unbeliever. Lay out a true, a pure, a faithful witness to the good news of Jesus Christ. And the Holy Spirit will do the work of drawing people in. Thank you very much.